Thank you for having me here. I'm going to try and shift gears a little bit, talk about something different. And that's going to be what I think is probably the most important conversation, which is about artificial intelligence, and has a direct role with respect to energy. I just flew in, so I'm a little bit tired, but I was on a red eye from LA. I was at a private event past 2 days. I was with Secretary Wright and some other people. You know, I think I heard something at the conference that I was at about how you can have good policies and lose the politics. I think this is really important because a lot of the politics around climate were lost a long time ago, which doesn't mean that it's not important to kind of come back, but I think there's a narrative around AI that's developing, and that hasn't moved yet. And like climate, there's a false narrative that's gaining some steam. How many in the room here how many believe that AI is going to decimate the jobs of your children or grandchildren? How many believe that, that you're going to pay for that destruction by having higher electricity prices from AI? Okay. So the left is actually working, and that's patently false. There is actually zero evidence that data centers are actually driving up electrical prices here in the United States. Now, I'm not saying that that can't happen. A lot of the AI, load projections are from artificial intelligence. But if we look over the past 20 years, there was basically zero load growth. I'll stick to the US, I can apply it globally here, but there was basically zero load growth in the US over the past 20, even 30 years. And yet we doubled our economy, our GDP. So how do you do that? Well, one, if we look at energy intensity per dollar of GDP in 1976, it was about 12.6 megajoules per dollar. By 1990, that had come down to about 8 megajoules per dollar. Many would say, well, those are efficiency gains, technology, right? Where, problem is we have this little thing called Jevons paradox, or what's known as economic rebound, and so we can, rebut to some of that. Today, it's at 4.2 megajoules per dollar of GDP. The answer to that is we offshored. We don't manufacture the things. I mean, just look around, right? And COVID taught us this about supply chains and braking. I think Iran's teaching this, another lesson right now in terms about supply chains. And I would argue that, the US hegemon in terms of our regional monopoly from a dollar supremacy, that is shifting. And if that shifts to a multipolar economy, then what are the implications of that? Well, we have to reshore. We're going to have to bring manufacturing back. And that's going to require a lot of energy. Now, data centers are interesting because they operate exactly the same as a steel mill or a shipyard or a chemical refinery or a semiconductor manufacturing facility. And this starts to become really important because if we look at the energy policy, and by the way, I was part of the problem. Right? I helped during the Obama administration in terms of US energy policy. At that time, we were optimizing for a service-based economy, not manufacturing. And so if you shift back to manufacturing, there's a different component of quality that needs to be brought back in terms of your energy, which is baseload. And renewables cannot do baseload, no matter what people say. No matter how many batteries you add. In fact, solar and wind indirectly are increasing the pollution in the US and are actually if you want to talk about CO2, wind and solar are driving up CO2 emissions, not down, indirectly. Why? Because you're actually increasing the number of peakers to try and stabilize the grid from a balancing perspective. And you want to know what's driving up prices? It's not AI data centers, it is renewable portfolio standards. That is exactly what is the problem. But there's a narrative that is winning. So the policies, the Trump administration has some great policies. Politics, maybe questionable, but we're losing right now in turn, I said where, but there's a losing battle in terms of that narrative, which is going to play out in the midterms here. Look at the obstructionist states that are pushing back and saying, oh, NIMBYism, you don't want that here. I actually saw on Twitter the other day that there was a regulator's house that was shot up. I mean, how horrific is that? That someone shot up a house saying, don't put a data center here. We're starting to see political violence that's coming in, more often, and hopefully, that shouldn't be tolerated no matter what your position is on anything. But, I think we're seeing more and more of this. It's an interesting, Senator Lee, and I work with his staff on a lot of the data that we publish, and I've put together a 5-point plan for energy abundance in the United States that we sent to the White House and the Senate has. Hopefully they'll listen. I think there's a lot of good information. One of the main tenets of that is building firm baseload fast. And I'll get to some. There's a couple, I was telling somebody earlier, like the game Jenga, there's a few perverse laws that if you can kind of move them out, the whole system will change. And we can actually see costs come down. We can see national security improve. Because, by the way, everything, upstairs there's an economic conference. I helped co-found the Biophysical Economics Institute. And I've been railing on neoclassical economic theory because it's patently false too. It misunderstands energy. Now, I think maybe at the time that in post-World War II, when a lot of the Keynesian policies were put forth, energy was freely available. So I'll say it's more of a correlation versus a causation effect. But if you start looking at the economy with energy as a substrate, I mean, what is productivity if we look at the productive function? Labor and capital? Well, what's labor without energy? It's a corpse. What's capital without labor? It's a statue. Neither are productive. Energy is the substrate for the economy. And if you start looking through that lens, you'll start to see everything. So I'm going to try and give maybe a magician's take on this and try and show you what the trick is. It's not magic here, but it is a sleight of hand. And by the way, no matter what your worst expectations are in terms of what's happening, it's worse than that. All right. When I was in the 90s, I was a professional skier. I lived in Utah, and I went back to I was back to look at a project that were from a financial perspective, and I was in southern Utah, and I saw the beautiful landscape is just thousands of miles of pockmarked with windmills. And if you've ever been to a wind farm, what you'll notice is when you actually go by them, what you will see are shredded bird carcasses. Tons of them. In fact, eagles, raptors, things that we try and protect. I own a farm. By the way, what we didn't say is my daughter rides an equestrian, which is why I have to work for the rest of my life. And so I'm constantly on, if I'm putting around on my tractor on my farm. By the way, I could not have a farm which our fertilizer feeds 300 different families in terms of the manure and compost. I couldn't do any of that without diesel or a lot of labor, but it's just not possible. I mean, the best way to kind of understand energy policies is to have a farm. When you have to do these things yourself, it changes. So anyways, going back to the Utah story. So I'm down there, I see all the windmills, see the bird carcasses, and whose state? Well, Senator Lee. And by the way, Senator Lee is probably the best. He's head of the energy subcommittee, and he probably understands what's going on better than anyone else, and it's still happening in his backyard. And so you're seeing, and we're here in Virginia, or DC, I should say. So part of the PJM, where you've had 1,000% increase in electricity prices, where the capacity auctions have literally broken. And so all of this is a function of really bad policy and those renewable standards that are being put forth. And I don't think it's hopeless. When someone says the green scam, how many of you understand the mechanics behind that, the incentives? Couple. Okay. So usually you think, oh, it's wind and solar, but this is a politically biased, and some people will shut down if you hear that, and by design, I guess. So what the incentives are, though, I'm going to give you a few mechanics. So if I'm a public utility and I sign an IPP with a independent power producer that's providing solar or wind, let's take wind just because I'm railing on wind at the moment, but solar is even worse, actually. And so I get a subsidy of about 4 cents per kilowatt. And so if I'm the utility and the wind is blowing, I'm going to use that wind first. That's my mandate from an RPS perspective. So, and I'm going to shut down because wind isn't dispatchable, and so I can't count on that. I'm going to shut down my peaker plant, and so I'm going to save about 2 cents. So that's the trade, 4 cents for 2 cents. We're paying 4 cents of tax dollars for a savings of 2 cents, right? That is not sustainable, but it gets worse because the wind or the solar are usually not co-located with where you need the power. So I have to build transmission. Now, utilities love transmission because if I'm a public utility, I get a guaranteed 9.75% rate of return on my asset base. So how do I build value? I build my asset base. So I want to build more low quality assets from a generation, which is going to force more transmission, which is going to allow me to go back to my constituents and increase the rates, which is going to allow my value as a stock to actually go up. And therein is the incentive that is happening here. Now, luckily, I think this is becoming better known because what's happening is the variability, because the wind and the sun doesn't always shine, that variability that's being put into the grid is actually, when we had 0% penetration, we went to 1% penetration of variable assets, it was hidden by the thermal inertia, and that's no longer hidden anymore. So as we've reached saturation in all the ISOs across the US, that's becoming better known. And that's like, a stock where you have a bunch of hedge funds come in and increase the volatility. We're just increasing the volatility within our energy systems. Okay, now maybe I'll be the one that'll go over, so I'll try and be quick here. All right, how do I operate this thing? So we put out this analysis called racks and stacks. So when we talk about, there's trillions of dollars of capital that is going into the ground to fund a lot of the artificial intelligence. And I think artificial intelligence is very much like, whether we want to compare it to the printing press or the automobile, all we're doing is taking energy and we're down converting that to intelligence, which is allowing new models to be open, which is going to be Jevons paradox in action, where the efficiency gains will only increase because there's high social utility, increase the amount of usage. But we're short by about 100 gigawatts. I'm giving rough, we have exact estimates here, and we go really deep into this, my team does, from a work perspective. So we're short about 100 gigawatts of electricity, which is a lot. And you're seeing companies like GE Vernova, Mitsubishi, or Siemens Energy that are sold out of turbines through 2031. By the end of this year, we predict they'll be sold out through 2034. When we look at nuclear, by the way, if you just buy into what I'm saying in terms of solar and wind, you can't do base load, no amount of batteries, because each 4-hour increment of batteries pushes your total cost up by 30%. So if we look at adding base load to the grid, you basically have hydroelectric, not a lot of rivers that you're going to dam up. You got nuclear, coal's unpalatable right now from a political perspective, and you have natural gas. Natural gas is the the de facto winner right now, but your turbines are getting sold out. Now, as I said, there's some perverse laws, so I'll give you an action item. There's what's known as new service review. So we have about 362 peaker plants, which are simple cycle turbines. The capacity factor is only about 13% in the US. And It's going down because, again, we look at the start-stop data. So we have models that have hourly nodal data. So we actually measure every asset that's operating and when it's operating. So really good information around this. So we have 98% R squared in terms of some of these models. So high correlation here. So when we look at the peakers, you could upgrade those. And you could basically spend, so a new turbine is about $3,000 a kilowatt to put in. You could put a heat recovery unit on one of these peakers, turn it into a intermediate or even a combined cycle for about 600 kilowatts. So much lower in terms of pricing. However, there's a law that will trigger that becomes what's known as a new service review. And that puts you into in a non-attainment, you're going to be in a 4-year window of review. And so if that law can be reversed, you could get an instant 53 gigawatts on the grid right now. You'd solve about 40% of the need. That's why I was talking to some of the politicians yesterday. So there's agency. Go back to your senators, your congressmen. Talk about how this bill needs to be repealed. This can change a lot of that. And I think as you go to your cocktail parties, you talk to your friends, and they say, oh, these data centers, these ugly data centers, that's just the stalking horse. It's the new boogeyman. And you're all familiar from a climate perspective. It's just climate, I don't know who the Al Gore is in this, but that's, that is what's happening right now. And the data doesn't show that any of that is what's actually happening. It's actually the opposite. And the politicians, like a good magician, are having you focus over here to try and get you to ignore the bad policies that have been created over here. That's it for me.